All right. So we're going to go through some opening moves first. The objective and kind of intended outcome for tonight is hopefully how you explore how you can build diversity, equity, and inclusion and a sense of belonging in your own districts and in your own home communities. And hopefully you can take away some protocols or some strategies or even just some new thinking and mindset shifts that will help you in your endeavors in your own district. So like I said, we'll start with some opening moves. We're going to go into a World Cafe or a heavily modified World Cafe since we're on Zoom. I'm going to share a little bit about my story in Duxbury and in the Duxbury public school system. And then we'll talk about some collective meaning making and more strategies, and then open it up to questions if you have any. What I like to do is start every meeting or every conversation with staff with opening with community and grievance. So I've shared 4 of my favorite here. If you wonder, ask. Really, we need to create conditions where we pursue learning, where we push and probe each other's thinking. Number 2, that we experience discomfort. I think we need to think about learning in and of itself is a productive struggle. So how do we as the adults embrace that productive struggle? How do we experience that discomfort and lean in to that challenge? That we step up, that we step back, and that we seek out. So thinking about we're contributing our own thoughts and sharing our own truth, whatever that may be, but we're also embracing other people's voices and various perspectives and different opinions, and making sure that people who may not have had a chance to share anything, that they have that space to do so. And the most important one for me that I often lean into is that we acknowledge intent, but we own impact, right? We know often that we share things and we are sharing with very good intentions, but sometimes those words or our actions may impact others in a way that we're not aware of. And we have to be willing to be like, oh my God, I totally stepped in it and I apologize. And I want to repair that harm for what I said. So really thinking about that. So to ground our discussion for tonight, I want us to really think about how equity is a journey, right? It is not a destination. It is not something that you check off. I often in my own home district am like, okay, so this feels like check-woody work. This isn't what it is. How do we lean in and embed practices to further the educational landscape? How do we create that meaning making with our colleagues, with our students, with our families, with school committees, with school councils, with all of the different people, all those stakeholder groups to create the pathway? And that equity becomes part of this daily thing that we're thinking about constantly. And we know that we might not ever get to that end final destination, but that we work each day to create those pathways for ourselves and for our students. All right, so like I said, we'll see how this goes. This is new for me doing a World Cafe on Zoom. So a World Cafe is basically a collaboration strategy. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And really what it is, it's putting people together in small groups around cafe tables, if you will, with a prompt or a question given by the facilitator. And ideally, you're moving through several rounds of conversation to create that meaning making, to create that collective understanding so that all these different conversations, these ideas, these themes, they cross-pollinate. And so by the end, you have found, oh, we've discovered, we do have this in common, or wow, that was really something I had never thought of. And that's really important to bring into the discussion. And through that identification of patterns and themes and knowledge, we have that sound foundation of understanding together. So what I'm going to have you do first, and you certainly don't have to take out a piece of paper or open a document. You can just think about it if you want. But I want you thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These 3 big words that I feel like you say them and people have the range of reactions to those words is all over the place. But just take a moment to think about them. Think about what comes to mind. How would you define it? What do the words mean to you? Are there buzzwords? Do you feel like it's consistent in your own district? Are there clear differences? Do they overlap? Do they hold hands? And then I'd love for you to just drop in the chat as you were thinking about those words. What did you notice? What comes to mind? And how might you define them? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And I will say, I have impeccable wait time. So I will wait until some brave souls add some brilliant. There we go. Thank you, Vidula. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Variety and variability. I love that. I feel like we all come from different places and have different life experiences, and that really frames how we think about these words. Thank you, everyone. I feel like I see a lot of common themes about what you're saying. And I really love, Sarah, equity is making sure what people get what they need. I had a student, I really love to highlight student voice. So I had a student one time, I was like, well, how do we define equity? And they were like, well, we all learn differently. So it just means we get what we need. And I was like, that was perfect. Put that on a t-shirt. That's exactly what it is. Thank you, Nicole. Diversity isn't just our differences, but it's how we acknowledge and celebrate them and call those strengths into the room to frame our thinking, to frame our instructional practices. Jess, yes, absolutely. When institutions are trying to check a box, they put everything under this one umbrella. And that's what I feel like is that checkwoody work and thinking about how do we avoid that? Like, this isn't checking a box, this isn't linear thinking. So how do we really dig in and engage in these conversations? All right, in the interest of time, please keep populating the chat with your brilliance, but I am going to move on to the next part of our World Cafe. Oh, here we go. Whoops. So what I'm going to do next is I really believe in the power of sharing our own voices. So in this modified World Cafe, I am going to pop everyone totally randomly into a breakout room. And I'd love for you to share your thinking with your brilliant colleagues. And the question is pretty simple. How do you define, explain, understand each term, diversity, equity, and inclusion? So however, whatever is on your mind, share that with your colleagues, and then we'll come back together in about 5-ish minutes to bring the group back together. And I'm going to see if I can remember. Feels like a decade ago when I was making breakout rooms, and I know it wasn't that long ago.
I can put everyone in the breakout rooms.
Ooh,
I just want to give everyone a minute to at least write down the questions.
Absolutely.
Just because when they go there, they won't see anything.
Perfect. And I'll pop the question in the chat too. That way, so once you get into those breakout rooms,
Okay.
you have it with you. So in the chat, you have the question.
And if you're still here in the main room, just please accept going into the breakout room so you can partake in this activity. Did you want that to end already? I'm sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
realize there was a
Oh
timer
my
on there.
gosh, that's
Okay, cool.
totally fine. Absolutely. I know that probably felt super quick for all of you, but hopefully you had at least a moment to share some of your thinking with your colleagues across the Commonwealth.
For us, we did.
Good.
Mhm.
Good. And I think we have
Okay.
most people back. I'd love for anyone who is in a group to any brave souls who want to share out just maybe some high level overview takeaways from your conversation, what you were thinking. Did you find there were agreements, disagreements, anything you feel like that would be important to share with the group?
And if you could just please use your virtual hand and then we'll go in that order. Okay, Nicole. Nicole, you can go.
What?
Oh, yeah, I think you're muted, Nicole. Yeah. Are you unable to unmute? Okay, that's all right. We can move to Rachel.
Instead of 7:30, which is when I asked for it to be, I'm going to, this is.
Rachel, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. we can.
Oh, okay, great. So I wanted to apologize to the person that was in the room with me because I just totally like hijacked the whole time. Like, and I spoke, but she seemed very welcoming and interested. I was just sharing mostly about some stuff that I just started doing a student equity council in the middle school that I work on. I'm actually a school nurse, and so I mean, again, she was very open to listen and seemed to be interested in what I had to say about that. I just had mentioned that this was new in Brockton, implementing this in the middle schools. We didn't really have any kind of structure or anything to follow. And one of the first things that I thought was really important was actually to define these three terms, because I do think they can be very confusing. I feel like I'm 48 years old and only have just started to truly understand what these words mean. So just explaining this stuff to the students.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicole. And I really appreciate how you included student voice in that process. I think that's fundamental to our shared understanding and shared like vision, right? We can't do this work if everyone isn't on board. So thank you for sharing. So what I have up here, so I did the World Cafe with our educators. I did it with our administrative team. I did it with families in the community. I did it with students, which was my favorite part. I will be totally transparent and honest. Trying to come up with a succinct definition for big words like these was a laborious process, right? And people, we're all teachers. We know we can be kind of specific. Well, I don't really like that word. What about this word? But this is what we landed on in Duxbury. And I am by no means saying these are the right definitions because I don't believe there is a right definition, but this is how we have embraced the language and the words, and really making sure of this meaning making, that we have this fundamental understanding so that when we say diversity in Duxbury, it doesn't mean what you hear in the media. It doesn't mean all of that noise, right? This process enabled us to block that out. I will share my favorite part was doing it with the students, and they're incredible, right? They have these creative ideas, and so they're looking at equity, and they start writing dollar signs, and I'm like, why do you have a dollar sign there? Right? And they're like, well, equity is like money, Miss Sheehan, right? Like you build equity in your house, and I was like, oh my goodness, right? For those of you who know Duxbury, I'm sure you have your own perceptions about who we are as a community, but fascinating that the students, what their understanding was, well, no, equity is money. And I was like, sure, equity absolutely is money, but we're talking about diversity and we're talking about inclusion. Do you think we're talking about money? And they're like, oh no, probably not. And so really getting them to understand very quickly, they then went to equality, right? Well, everyone gets the same thing. And I'm like, well, Okay, but that's not what equity is. Equity is getting what you need to find success. Equity is getting what you need to reach your potential. Whether that means you need a writing tool, whether that means you need voice to text, whatever that looks like, that's what equity is. And so that every individual has that obstacle-free access to be who they are, to show up and to find success. And by defining these words, I will say it's been especially helpful with the community and with our school committees. I think that sometimes can be a point of tension for educators. And so when you have, it takes that the feelings and emotions off of you as the person trying to advocate, and you just get to go, no, I hear what you're saying, I understand, but this is actually what we mean. And you can point right to that definition, which is super helpful. So just giving a brief background on the story of Duxbury, and if you have watched the news in the last 3 or 4 years, you may know a whole lot about us. But I think what people don't know is prior to our really public anti-Semitic incident, we were digging in on the work. I was still a 7th grade teacher at the time. And for me, thinking back to the COVID times, I really think about the racial reckoning that this country went through. And that's how I think of spring 2020. And I very nervously but bravely reached out to my assistant superintendent and superintendent at the time. It was like, look, I am on Zoom talking to little black boxes and like blank screens with names. And we're not talking about what's going on. We're not talking about the feelings that our kiddos have. We're not talking about what they're seeing on the news. And I can't stand by idly and allow this to continue. And I was super fortunate. I know this is not the case for everyone, to have an assistant superintendent who said, all right, well, what are we going to do? And I was like, well, let's get groups of educators together. Let's compile resources for people. And so in that moment, we created an anti-racist book club. We attended the anti-racist teach-in, and then we developed a task force. Fortunately, that was some of our proactive work, because by the spring of 2021, like I said, we were catapulted into national news. And we had a very reactive response to that incident. And again, still a 7th grade teacher, my superintendent came to me and was like, well, what do we do? And I said, well, we name it. Like, we don't sweep this under the rug. We don't do anything else. We name it, we own it. And it doesn't mean it represents who we are as a community, but it does represent feelings and sentiments and values that exist here. And we need to walk through that and own it. And if we don't, then this gets even messier. And what happened there basically was, I said to our superintendent, listen, you're not going to be able to do this. You need a DEI director. And that is now how I transitioned very quickly from 7th grade teacher to a central office role as DEI director in Duxbury, which has been both super powerful and super exhausting at times. From there, with the creation of the DEI position, I did a stakeholder analysis, entry planning, and again, really dove into that meaning making and capacity building, thinking about who are we as educators, how do we show up in our classrooms, in our learning spaces, and what are those commonalities that bring us together. We then did a comprehensive equity audit, which was really helpful for our district. You had an outside voice to come in and say, hey, this is what's going really well, and this is what's not. And these are the inequities that surfaced. And here are some action steps we recommend you dig in and dive in on. And again, leaning into that common language, but also talking about the systems. And I think that's really, really powerful, because we all know that these systems are inherently racist and biased. But also what I've found, especially in my community, which is a predominantly white, predominantly upper class, right? And so the attitudes often are, well, why do we don't need to talk about this. And it's like, well, we actually need to talk about this probably most of all. And so looking at how does the public school system create inequities? So taking kind of that fear, people are always afraid to make a mistake or say the wrong thing. It's easy to blame the system, right? I often think about a quote, I didn't build this house, but I live in it. And so how are we going to restructure and rethink? And hopefully that alleviates some of that stress or that fear to engage in these conversations. Again, just going back to what I was talking about, our proactive responses, leveraging our community, recognizing and naming the importance. And obviously our response to the anti-Semitic incident had to start in a reactive space. We had to investigate, we had to communicate. But the goal really is, how do you move from that reactive space so that you don't like live in that, but you move to a more proactive space where people feel comfortable engaging these conversations, that hopefully when something maybe big happens, you're in a space of like, yeah, no, we're well prepared. We've got go-to language, we've got go-to protocols, we've got go-to systems to lean on to help us through that situation. So the next thing I want you to think about, I feel like this work, well, being an educator alone, DEI or not, is overwhelming, right? You, I'm sure, have an endless to-do list of 5,000 things that you have to do, grade and plan and this and that, and it's the end of the year, so there's award nights and all of these things, right? How do you alleviate that pressure? And what I find super helpful is thinking about things I can control and things I can't control. And knowing that, okay, I can control this, I can't control that. And so I'm going to have to let that go and let that pass and kind of live in that ambiguity and that unfinished space, right? If we go back to thinking about equity as a journey, it's okay to take a step back and be like, you know what, I can't own that and I can't fix that. And so I'm going to focus on what I can control. So I'd love for you to dig a little bit deeper. You can of course think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I'd love for you to also think about identity, your own identity, the identity of your students, your teams, who you work with, and also cultural responsiveness. What does that look like in your classroom spaces? And thinking about what's in your control and what's beyond your control. And so while you're thinking about that, examples of things you can control, obviously, your own emotions, your own words, your own tone. I feel like I very often have a pretty sharp tone. I think there is, well, I want to disrupt a sense of urgency. There also is urgency to this work. And thinking about sometimes how do I speak and how is that going to land for someone is super important. My body language, my expressions, do my actions match up with what I said I was going to do? That's fundamental, right? My own interests, my values, how I plan, what I prioritize, that's all within my control. What I can't control is that time is always going to pass, that parents or community members or even staff and students may have negative reactions to what I say. I can't control what other people are interested in or what they might want to prioritize. I can't control their body language or their words or their tone. And so really thinking about, what can I own and what do I not own? What can I control and what can I not control? So I'd love for you to take another minute and think, and then share in the chat if you feel comfortable. Considering your own teaching and leadership style, and I will say, teachers are leaders. Like, it doesn't matter if you have a leader role or name or whatever that means. You are an educator, and by nature, you are a leader. You are leading students to something greater and more powerful and more humane. And so when you think about DEI or DEI work or identity work or cultural responsiveness, what is in your control and what is outside of your control? And what actions, mindsets, and strategies that are within your control have you found useful or helpful when engaging in this work? Thank you for sharing in the chat. I love who are your allies. I think when you're doing this work, you can't do it alone. There's power in numbers. And so who can you lean on? Who are your co-conspirators? How do you support each other? How do you value each other? I love the information about your curriculum. Like, yes, sometimes we could have a whole nother session on DESE and what they dictate in terms of curriculum. but we do have the opportunity to pull outside of kind of that dictated curriculum, to pull in voices that maybe aren't always heard, to pull in different perspectives, to pull in those unseen stories. Excellent. If you want to keep adding your ideas just to share with the other members on this Zoom, that would be wonderful, but I am going to move on just in the interest of time. So thinking about what you can control and how you continue to make meaning making, I fundamentally believe in the power of relationships. And so what I often lean on is what I like to call a stakeholder analysis. I will say my other administrative colleagues were a little horrified when I said, yeah, when I got this job, I like plotted you guys all out and tried to figure out, like, in terms of DEI work, were you an ally? Were you not? Were you sitting on the fence? But really thinking about the people who you work with. Where do they land? Are they in agreement with you? Do you share common values? And do you trust them? Do you trust them to have authentic conversations, to show up as who you are? And then if you don't, how do you move that needle? How do you move those people? And I believe that is continued open conversation and open dialogue. And really, again, if you've done that work of meaning making and creating common definitions, you go back to that, right? And you lean in and you push their thinking grounded in, hey, remember, we decided this is what diversity means. This is what equity means. Like, let's talk about that. Let's unpack that. How do we get there? What does that look like? What ideas do you have? And hopefully that continues to build the trust. That continues to build that common collective knowledge and understanding among your team or within your community. Some other strategies that we've found helpful. I know someone in the chat said they hadn't, which I will say, I am surprised that you had not heard about our anti-Semitic incident. Basically what happened, just in short, we had anti-Semitic play calls with our football team and our football coaches. And it became very public, and it was absolutely very damaging to our community and our culture. And we worked through that again by centering those feelings, by naming them, and by creating these spaces. We held forums to discuss that. We also created a core values statement. This is a statement that's used by all the schools in our district, our faculty, our administrators, also our school committee, which took a little bit of work. But we use that again to go back to, this is who we are and this is what we believe. And if this is who we are and what we believe, then there is no place for bias or discriminatory language or racist behavior. And that we affirm that statement. So it exists in paper in all of our school handbooks, but it's also a living language document that we go back to and we state frequently at various meetings or shared spaces or shared learning spaces within the school community and within the greater community. We also equipped ourselves with go-to language. I think sometimes there is a fear of, in the society right now with book banning and with the divisiveness that exists, it can be hard to jump in. And you might be thinking, well, I do really want to read this book with my students, but I'm afraid of the reaction. What if a parent emails me? And what if they go ballistic? And what will I say? So what we did was we draft really common go-to language, right? I remember stepping into this role and thinking about, okay, am I going to get a whole bunch of emails about critical race theory? And how do we unpack that? And making sure that everyone in the school community said, thank you so much for your inquiry. We really appreciate you reaching out and engaging in an open dialogue. But let's refer back to our core value statement. Yes, this is happening. No, this is happening, but this is what we stand by and this is what we do. And really having those documents or that language, I hope for my teachers at least and my educators and support staff in the building that it alleviates some of that fear. And I will just say, as an administrator in the district, it is fundamentally my job to protect my staff. And they know that at every juncture, if they find themselves in a position that they're like, oh, this is bad, and I don't know how to answer that, they have me to call in and call on to help them navigate that, to answer, to be a wall if they need it, to stand in front of them or behind them or beside them, whatever they need. And I do hope that you have that. I know that maybe, I hope it's not uncommon. But if you don't, that you push for that you push for the people who have power within your school community to leverage that power, and to flex a little and be like, no, my teachers are reading this book because it's important. My staff is doing this activity or visiting this museum or engaging in this unit because it's fundamental to learning. That if we don't have diverse perspectives in our classroom, that's not innovative thinking, right? We all want innovative students who change the world. If they all think the same, that's not innovation. And using kind of that language to bring the temperature down has been helpful. Another thing we often do is use protocols to kind of keep conversations really tight. And we also use previously created documents to ground those conversations, documents that educators are familiar with, that the school community is familiar with. So I'm sure many of you have a portrait of a graduate. And so what we did was we took on a whole staff PD day, we took groups of our educators pre-K through 12, and we put them in classrooms, and we had each grade level represented. And we had them give us feedback on the portrait of a graduate, thinking about connections, thinking about challenges that they wanted to make or positions that they wanted to argue within the portrait of graduate, concepts that they thought were important or vital to the education, and changes in attitude or thinking or action that would be required to actually make the portrait of a graduate a living document. From there, what we did, we took all of the teacher feedback, right? We say student voice is super important, and it absolutely is, but educator voice is fundamentally important too. And so we took all of that feedback and we aligned it into 3 themes. And the 3 themes that our teachers came up with were coherence, were micro moves, and were academic resilience. So how do we continue to work together collectively? What are those small steps? Again, this feels super overwhelming, but what are those little things we can each do day to day to change the narrative? And then how do we continue to build academic resilience? What we did from there was brought in or leveraged our student voice. So we shared with students just a super quick Google form, and it had 4 sentence stems. Dear teacher, I wish my teacher knew. I wish my teacher would. I wish my teacher wouldn't. And we had 500 plus responses. We did give it to just grades 6 through 12, hoping that that would be kind of some cleaner, more succinct information. And what the students came back with was an overwhelming attitude of gratitude for our teachers. And so we started there like, hey, we know these kids, when you're in there with 30 of them in a classroom, you want to rip your hair out, but they do care about you and they do value you. And so we started in that place of gratitude, and then we moved into, here's some of the feedback that the students give. One that really resonated with me was, I wish my teacher knew I didn't love being the class clown, and really called in their experience and their story and their identity to continue to move forward. And then from there, like I said before, we blamed the system, right? We took the ownership. This isn't the fault of us as human beings, but it is the system as a whole. So I don't know how many folks are familiar with the National Equity Project. If you're not, it's a great resource. There's lots of different ideas. I will say the Liberatory Action Steps is excellent. And please feel free to email me. I put my email on the front of the slides if you want more information about that. But we did what's called the History of Public Schooling activity. And basically what that is, it's printouts of different events in education, dating back from the start of education all the way up to now. And they highlighted how inequitable the system was. And so what we did was we had teachers talk about, okay, so how does the system replicate or produce inequitable systems? How does that play out in Duxbury? And how might I, as the educator, inadvertently be playing a role in that system? We grounded the conversation. This table is adapted from the Street Data book, if you're familiar with that. And we talked about this idea of perfectionism, either or thinking, defensiveness, and power hoarding. And how do these characteristics show up within the system? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What resonates with us? I will say I am totally a little bit of a power hoarder where I'm like, we just got to get this done. I just got to do it. And then I have to remind myself, slow down. You can collaborate with others. You can relinquish that power and control. And what are the antidotes to that? What could we be doing if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, my lesson plan has to be perfect? What might be an antidote to that? Or if I'm thinking about Our grading system is terrible, and you really find yourself in that either or thinking. How can you push yourself to think, well, there aren't two alternatives. It isn't good or bad. This isn't a binary. How can I think about this complex system in a different way to change it? I will say, I'm sure some of you are like, oh no, she's going to talk about data. Of course, she's an administrator. I want to talk about data because I fundamentally believe if you want to change the game, you got to play the game a little bit. And who I am as an educator is very much a storyteller. So data to me, I think I often thought about data as like numbers and pie charts, and like that is not my thing. I don't care about that. But people are often saying, okay, well, yeah, sure, we want to do DEI work and we want to be culturally responsive, but how do we measure it? And what about the student outcomes? And what about MCAS? And what about the AP scores? And what about, and what about? And so really what I have tried really hard to do is think about, well, if you want to be culturally responsive, you do have to be data literate. And that doesn't always have to be at odds with deeper learning, with cultural responsiveness, and thinking about, okay, well, yes, we want this certain outcome. Then we got to talk about the process and what that looks like. We have to talk about, we collect information on our students, we engage in this inquiry orientation, but are we actually talking about students beyond those numbers, beyond an iReady report, beyond an MCAS score? How do we think about who they are as learners, who they are as humans, and really using that as data too? And so I'm sure many of you have heard this idea about street data. That satellite data is kind of that MCAS stuff. That map data is your more common assessments and student skill gaps. But how do we ground ourselves in listening to the humans within our systems? How do we get to hear their stories, tell their stories, and use that as a fundamental foundation of data? And I think that's really important. And it's a good way to kind of, if you're finding yourself in your own district, like, oh, this feels really hard and I'm not sure where to start and where do I go? And people are always talking about, well, we have to talk about student outcomes. Really think about that street data and leveraging that. Kiva panels are a great way to bring folks together to have conversations, focus groups, and like pull that information in to ground your work and pushing forward and moving forward. Some specific strategies. So thinking about, these are a little bit reactive. At our elementary, we conduct responses and restorative consequences. So thinking about how do we create the space for kids to make mistakes and like in a really safe way. And then, okay, you made a mistake. How are we going to repair the harm that was had from that mistake? Similar at the middle school, where we have, again, go-tos. If someone uses dehumanizing language, for instance, how do we have a restorative conversation about that and bring folks together and make sure we honor those who have been harmed and that we provide the aggressor a chance to learn? I don't think we can't throw people away, right? Like I want students to be able to make mistake in our learning spaces so that they don't make those mistakes when they go out into the world and it gets bigger or the consequences get bigger. We hold space for conversations with our students. So we developed a DEI student advisory council that's made up of students in grades 7 through 12 within our district. And we leverage their brilliance. It is student-centered, student-organized, student-led. They teach to our younger students. They just, a couple of weeks ago, they did a lesson on democracy and voting. And they had the super fun competition to design an I voted sticker, but really letting them be the leaders and letting them kind of talk about what they know and how they can too lead this work. At a district level, I believe I mentioned we engaged in an equity audit. That was super helpful. We parlayed that equity audit into our strategic plan to make sure those two things were very much aligned. We have a bias response protocol so that we know when instances of bias come up, what the track is, what the path is, what does it look like. We have targeted communication in response to any issues that come up, whether that be the full school community, whether that be an announcement, whether it looks like counselor support in safe spaces and lunch groups or learning spaces. And then some of our proactive strategies include obviously representation within like creating, gosh, sorry about that. That scared the heck out of me. Creating those windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors within our classrooms for students to see themselves, but to also see others and really embrace the power of differences and celebrate that. At our middle school, we have different clubs and activities. And we really do lean into scenario-based discussions with our educators. So we'll throw up a different, it could be instructional, it could be someone says something that harmed other students in the class, it could be anything. It could be a parent sends an email that someone's flustered by. And we create the space for our educators to have that conversation and lean in and learn from each other. And that is fundamental. Again, I know that there are varying priorities and time is so little, but you have got to create the space for these conversations. Otherwise, nothing moves forward. We also have bias interrupters that were actually developed by our students. We have those hanging in all of our school buildings. And it's just like quick little sentence starters that we've seen our students use and our educators use all the time, right? When someone says something and you kind of get that reaction of like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say, or what if I say the wrong thing? By having this quick go-to, hey, that's really having an impact on me. Can you help me understand what you meant by that? Or did you mean to be hurtful when you said that? And so you have this kind of right in your brain, right in your toolbox, ready to go to create the space for that conversation. At our high school, like I said, we talked about our DEI Student Advisory Council. We also have consistent student leadership training. So we have partnered with the Northeastern Sports and Society. We have used Facing History, Safe Schools. I cannot say enough about the Safe Schools through DESE. They do incredible work, especially when it comes to gender and gender identity. I will give them a plug too. It is free. So if your district says no, you say, oh yes, this is free. You find the time and make it happen, because they really have some incredible folks there. And again, regular recognition of underrepresented groups. And I will say too, a lot of the work for me is avoiding kind of this shallow representation. We don't just talk about Black history in February. We talk about Black history every day, because that's what it is. It is American history. We don't just talk about Pride and LGBTQ month in June. We talk about that every single day, because that is us. That is who we are as a community, as a nation, and really getting the teachers to be comfortable with that, right? Like, this is stuff that should be ingrained throughout. Sure, it's powerful to have a month to do some extra stuff to celebrate the achievements and joy of different communities, but it's got to be embedded in the day-to-day. It cannot be a one-off. And then at the district level, we have a DEI website that basically has like all of the stuff that I'm talking about. So that's totally accessible to folks in the community. We have a culturally responsive teaching protocol that we use and a walkthrough guide that we use, that we partner with each other to co-teach and build our capacity, that we actually really create these trusting relationships to lean on each other. And we prioritize and focus our community and our core values. That's super fundamental and important. And then just kind of some micro moves, which is really just a basic summary of what I've been talking about. Again, leveraging student voice, relationship building. If you're familiar with Project Zero through Harvard, or it's no longer SRI, I believe it's with the Center for Leadership and Educational Equity. The CLE protocols are really excellent ways to create a safe space to have a difficult conversation. That we leverage formative assessments, that we are ongoing in our curricular analysis, that we don't just do these one-offs. Oh, let's check our curriculum for bias once every 3 years because DESE said we had to. No, we do that every day, that we are reflective practitioners who think about these things every day, that we talk about skills and proficiency-based focus, not that, yes, effort is fundamentally important for our students to come into the classroom with, but we have to remember that kiddos go home and their home life looks totally different. And so when you're putting a high grade on homework, is that equitable? Or should we think about a different system to ensure all students have access? At the building and department level, we use DataWise for our data conversations. We talk about our grading practices. We are totally in the thick of that right now, thinking about what do our grade mean? Everyone in Duxbury basically gets an A. What does that mean? Like, what does that actually mean? Our grades are super inflated. And so how do we have this conversation so that we know our grades actually represent what we want our students to know and be able to do? That we use inclusive language, and that we continue to build the leadership capacity. And then from the district and system level, again, I can't say enough about building the trust, building the coherence and consistency, committing or recommitting to our values, calling people in, and using the community and town connections in that capacity building work. Oops, there we go. And then just thinking quickly about your larger community, I will say we've had great success in thinking about, you've got to create this support network. Our town select board is fundamentally supportive of this work, and that is key. So when you think about the schools and the community and the town government, they together are the pillars for that collective DEI. So you think of like the three legs of a stool that holds up the work. These three groups are fundamental to that work, and thinking about how do you have a human rights council in your community that you might leverage for help? What does your select board do? Have they committed, have they made an affirmation statement to your community that says, yes, no, we stand by this. We're going to do this. We believe in this. Do they have a DEI committee at your town level? And what does that look like? And what is the work that they're doing? And then before I transition into questions, I can't believe it's almost 7 o'clock. The biggest piece of advice I can give you is just start. The conditions will never be right. It will never feel perfect. It will always be scary. Sometimes my voice will shake when I'm going to talk, and I'm like, no, Caitlan, just do it. Just say it. Just say what you're thinking. And really think about small is all. I'll lean on Adrienne Marie Brown. Take those small steps and just start and do this work and find some co-conspirators. You are always welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to partner with any of you. Even if you're like, I have this random question, can you help? Like, of course I can help. We're in this together. And the more we work and support each other, hopefully the quicker we move the needle and the easier it feels and the less scary it feels.